The pounding on my door jolted me awake at 6 a.m. Open up, Homeowners Association. I barely had time to throw on my robe when 4 men in black uniforms burst into my home, one of them shouting, "You don't belong here." I was still groggy, but 30 years of experience as a federal prosecutor had trained me to remain calm in chaotic situations. That's when I realized these weren't real police officers, yet they had no idea who they were confronting. What happened next would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Hey, if you're watching this video from your bathroom right now, drop a prosecutor in the bathroom comment below. I'm curious how many of you enjoy YouTube during your morning routine. I'm Thomas Mitchell, 72 years old, widowed, and a retired federal prosecutor who had moved to Maple Ridge Estates just 3 months ago. After my wife passed away last year, our family home felt too empty, too full of memories. My daughter Jennifer convinced me to move closer to her and my grandchildren, and Maple Ridge Estates seemed perfect, an upscale community with well-maintained grounds and supposedly friendly neighbors. I've always been a private man who enjoys simple pleasures, coin collecting, reading historical nonfiction, and woodworking in my garage, despite my age. I never mentioned my legal background to my new neighbors, not out of secrecy, but because I've never been one to flaunt my achievements. I simply introduced myself as a retired federal employee, which was technically true. The trouble began with something so trivial, it's almost laughable now. I had installed solar-powered landscape lighting along my front walkway. According to Maple Ridge Estates HOA regulations, all exterior lighting must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to installation, a rule buried on page 93 of the 137-page homeowner's manual that I had admittedly skimmed rather than studied. The first warning letter arrived 2 weeks after I completed the installation. I tossed it aside, thinking it was an overreaction to such a minor issue. The second notice came with a $75 fine, which I paid while rolling my eyes at the pettiness. My neighbor, Carmen Diaz, a retired civil rights attorney living next door, spotted me checking my mail that day. "Be careful with those HOA notices, Thomas," she warned with knowing eyes. "Bradley Reynolds runs this HOA like his personal kingdom. People who challenge him tend to find themselves in difficult situations." A week later, I noticed someone photographing my house. Not just a casual snapshot. This was methodical documentation, taking pictures from various angles, paying particular attention to my landscape lighting. When I stepped outside to inquire, the man hurried away, slipping into a black SUV parked down the street. That evening, another notice arrived, this time with a $250 fine and a warning that continued violations would result in escalating penalties and possible enforcement actions. The term enforcement action struck me as oddly threatening for a neighborhood association, but I still wasn't particularly concerned. The next day, I received an invitation to the monthly HOA meeting. It wasn't a friendly welcome. The letter specifically mentioned that my violations would be discussed. I decided to attend, if only to understand what exactly was happening in my new community. That HOA meeting was illuminating, to say the least. The community room was filled with about 40 residents, most looking either bored or mildly apprehensive. At the front sat 3 people behind a table: Bradley Reynolds, a stern-faced man in his early 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an expensive watch that he kept glancing at; Robert Grayson, a barrel-chested former sheriff with a perpetual frown; and Patricia Taylor, a thin woman who took meticulous notes and rarely spoke. Bradley ran the meeting with parliamentary precision, addressing routine matters with the gravity of Supreme Court proceedings. When they reached compliance issues, Bradley's eyes locked onto mine. "We have a new resident who seems to believe our community guidelines are optional," he announced. "Mr. Mitchell has violated Article 8, Section 3, Paragraph C of our covenant by installing unauthorized landscape lighting." I raised my hand to speak, but Bradley continued as if I hadn't moved. "This may seem like a minor issue to some, but our property values depend on consistency and compliance. One violation leads to others, and soon our beautiful community looks like," he paused dramatically, "a common neighborhood." Several residents nodded in agreement while others studied their hands, avoiding eye contact with either Bradley or me. When he finally acknowledged my raised hand, I stood and introduced myself calmly. I appreciate the community's standards, I began, but surely there's room for minor aesthetic variations that don't impact property values. The solar lighting actually complements the architectural style of. Bradley cut me off mid-sentence. The rules aren't a buffet, Mr. Mitchell. You don't get to pick which ones you'll follow. The fine stands, and you have 14 days to remove your unauthorized lighting, or the fines will triple. The next morning, my phone rang. The voice on the other end chilled me. Mr. Mitchell, we know what you're doing. Either you comply or you'll have to leave. The call ended before I could respond. I stood there momentarily stunned. In my years as a federal prosecutor, I'd received threats from desperate defendants and powerful criminals. But I never expected to be threatened over landscape lighting in a supposedly upscale neighborhood. What the caller didn't know was that I had faced far more dangerous adversaries than an overzealous homeowners association. The threat didn't frighten me. It awakened something I thought I'd left behind when I retired. A determination to see justice done. Bradley Reynolds, I soon learned from neighbors willing to whisper behind closed doors, was a retired commercial real estate developer who'd once managed large properties throughout the Northeast. What no one in Maple Ridge Estates knew, including Bradley himself, was that our paths had crossed before. 12 years ago, Reynolds Development Group had appeared in a federal case I prosecuted, defending against charges of fraudulent practices and environmental violations. I had won the case, resulting in substantial fines and a damaged reputation that eventually forced him to downsize and restructure. The Bradley Reynolds prowling our community with his clipboard and rule book was the same man who had stared daggers at me as the verdict was read years ago, though he hadn't recognized me yet. The coincidence was remarkable, but I had no intention of revealing our past connection unless absolutely necessary. I wasn't seeking revenge or confrontation. I had simply wanted a peaceful retirement. Now, however, I found myself documenting every interaction with the HOA. I noted the dates and times of the inspection visits, kept copies of every notice, and recorded phone calls, legal in our state with one-party consent. It wasn't paranoia. It was the methodical habit of someone who had spent decades building cases, and evidence was rapidly accumulating. Within a week of the threatening phone call, I received notices for new violations. My mailbox was half an inch taller than regulations permitted. A bird feeder in my backyard was visible from the street. There were reports of excessive noise from my garage where I had been working on a birdhouse. Each violation came with increasingly hefty fines. During this time, I met Michael Zhang, a 36-year-old software engineer who lived across the street. He had watched one of Bradley's enforcement officers measuring my mailbox with a ruler and had found it both amusing and disturbing. That's classic Bradley, Michael told me as we chatted on my porch one evening. He targeted me last year because my basketball hoop was apparently 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. $300 in fines later, I gave in and removed it. Michael became my first real ally in Maple Ridge Estates, followed quickly by Carmen, who had her own history with Bradley's regime. He's been running this place like a dictator for 7 years, Carmen explained. Most people either comply or move out. No one has successfully challenged him because he's got connections with the county commissioners and has deep pockets for legal battles. The situation escalated dramatically at the next HOA meeting. Bradley had scheduled a special session to discuss proposed amendments to the community regulations. The amendments would grant the HOA board expanded powers to conduct inspections with minimal notice, increase the maximum fines tenfold, and most tellingly, create special rules for residents who had moved in within the past year. The targeting was so obvious, it was almost comical. I attended the meeting and calmly raised points about the legality of such discriminatory policies. Bradley's response was to have Robert, his enforcer, interrupt me repeatedly and ultimately ask me to leave for disrupting proceedings. I left without argument, but not before noticing several residents exchanging troubled glances. Seeds of doubt about Bradley's leadership were being planted. That night, I began connecting dots that painted a disturbing picture. With Carmen's help, I discreetly reached out to former residents who had sold their homes under pressure from the HOA. A pattern emerged: targeted harassment through selective enforcement, escalating fines, and eventually an offer to purchase from the same real estate company, Ridgeview Partners, at below market rates. Further research revealed that while Bradley wasn't officially connected to Ridgeview Partners, his son-in-law was a junior partner. I was no longer dealing with mere petty tyranny. This was orchestrated fraud. When Michael installed security cameras around my home to help with a neighborhood watch project, I didn't object. Within days, those cameras captured HOA representatives conducting inspections of my property while I was out, entering my backyard without permission, and photographing every conceivable angle of my home. Bradley's next move surprised even me. He began a whisper campaign, suggesting I was a problem resident with a mysterious past. Then came the masterstroke, a formal letter claiming multiple residents had complained about suspicious behavior at my home and demanding I submit to a compliance inspection of the interior to ensure I wasn't violating the single-family residence requirement. It was absurd, overreaching, and almost certainly illegal, but it was also a calculated gamble that most residents would comply rather than engage in a protracted legal battle. Bradley had overplayed his hand. Instead of fighting the inspection directly, I employed a strategy that had served me well as a prosecutor: allow the overconfident to expose themselves further. I would let them come, let them enter my home, and let them build their own trap. The night before the scheduled inspection, I received a text from Michael: urgent. They're planning to raid your house tomorrow morning. They have an HOA search warrant. I smiled despite myself. Bradley had decided to escalate from harassment to intimidation. I made my preparations, setting out my best coffee service, placing specific legal documents in visible but not obvious locations, and ensuring all cameras were functioning. Then I went to bed and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The confrontation I had been preparing for was finally at hand. And despite the circumstances, I felt a familiar calm settling over me. The same calm I used to feel before delivering a closing argument. Bradley thought he was springing a trap. He didn't realize he was walking into one. What I didn't know that night was just how extensive Bradley's operations had become. Through information I pieced together later, I learned that Bradley had hired a private investigator to dig into my background. The PI had discovered I was a retired federal employee but hadn't identified my specific role. Federal records can be notoriously opaque when it comes to certain positions, and my privacy had been carefully maintained after retirement due to some of the high-profile cases I'd handled. This vagueness only fueled Bradley's suspicions and determination. He's hiding something, Bradley told his associates that night. Maybe he's running some kind of operation from that house. Maybe he's not even legally in this country. Whatever it is, we're going to find out tomorrow and use it to get him out. The harassment campaign against me wasn't unique. It was simply the latest in a long-running scheme. Bradley had been systematically targeting homeowners whose properties were strategically valuable for a larger development plan. The East Side properties, including mine, were the final pieces needed for a commercial development that would replace our homes with a luxury resort and golf course. The developer had promised Bradley a substantial consulting fee and a percentage of future profits in exchange for clearing the necessary properties. What made my case special was my resistance. Most residents had eventually buckled under the pressure, selling their homes at below-market rates just to escape the harassment. My stubborn refusal to be intimidated had thrown a wrench in their timeline, and the developers were getting impatient. The morning raid wasn't just about intimidation. They were genuinely looking for anything they could use as leverage. Meanwhile, I had been quietly building my own network of allies. Carmen had introduced me to several former residents who had been forced out by Bradley's tactics. They provided written statements about their experiences, creating a pattern of evidence. Michael had been monitoring HOA communications through methods he assured me were mostly legal and had discovered email exchanges discussing the targeted harassment campaign. Most importantly, a whistleblower from the county planning office, troubled by the cozy relationship between certain officials and Bradley's developer friends, had provided Carmen with documents showing the proposed commercial development that would replace our homes. The puzzle pieces were coming together, revealing a picture of corruption and fraud that extended well beyond homeowner harassment. All I needed now was to catch them in an undeniable act of misconduct, and their morning raid would provide exactly that. I spent the evening before the raid making final preparations, not just for the confrontation itself, but for its aftermath. I called Jennifer, my daughter, with specific instructions. I need you to be ready to come over tomorrow morning around 8 a.m. Bring your notary seal and the incorporation papers we discussed. As I arranged documents on my dining room table, including property records, HOA financial statements Carmen had obtained, and a carefully tabbed copy of the HOA covenant with numerous violations highlighted, I felt that familiar pre-trial focus sharpening my mind. Bradley thought he was orchestrating a show of force. He didn't realize he was walking onto a stage I had carefully set. The insistent pounding on my door began precisely at 6 a.m. jarring, but not unexpected. I was already dressed in a casual button-down shirt and khakis, sipping my first cup of coffee in the kitchen. I'd been awake for nearly an hour, reviewing my strategy and ensuring all recording devices were active. The knocking grew more aggressive, accompanied by shouts that were clearly meant to intimidate. Maple Ridge Association, open up immediately. I took a deliberate sip of my coffee, set the cup down carefully, and walked unhurriedly to the door. Through the peephole, I could see 4 men in black uniforms that bore a passing resemblance to police tactical gear, complete with patches that read HOA enforcement. I opened the door with a composed expression, as if being confronted by uniformed men at dawn was a perfectly normal occurrence. "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I do for you at this early hour?" I asked, my voice carrying the same measured tone I had used to address juries. Bradley stood at the front, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Behind him were Robert, the security manager, and 2 men I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mitchell," Bradley announced with exaggerated authority, "we have an inspection warrant authorizing us to examine your property for covenant violations." He thrust a document toward me, impressively official-looking but legally meaningless. "Step aside," Robert added gruffly, playing the role of tough enforcer. I examined the document with deliberate slowness, noting the forged signatures and invented legal terminology. Rather than pointing out its obvious invalidity, I simply stepped back from the doorway. "By all means, come in. Though I must say, this seems rather excessive for checking landscape lighting." They pushed past me into the entryway, their movements coordinated as if they had rehearsed this moment. One of the men immediately began photographing everything, while Robert started a prepared speech about community standards and necessary enforcement actions. Bradley, clearly the director of this production, pointed dramatically at my living room wall. "Unauthorized modification of interior structure. Section 12, paragraph 3. He was referring to a bookshelf I had built into an alcove, a modification that was explicitly permitted in the actual HOA guidelines. I said nothing, simply observing as they spread through my home with the confidence of men who believe they were untouchable. They opened closets, checked my refrigerator, examined my bathroom fixtures, all while maintaining a running commentary about violations and non-compliance. Throughout this invasion, I maintained a calm demeanor that seemed to increasingly unnerve them. They had expected resistance, anger, perhaps even fear. My placid cooperation was clearly not in their script. "You seem remarkably unconcerned, Mr. Mitchell," Bradley finally commented, his eyes narrowing. "Most residents understand the seriousness of these inspections." I smiled slightly. "I've always had great respect for proper authority and due process, Mr. Reynolds. I am simply observing both in action." Bradley's face tightened, but he continued his performance, directing his team to document every supposed infraction. "This is going to result in substantial fines, Mr. Mitchell. Possibly even eviction proceedings." I nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds quite serious. Would you like some coffee while you complete your work? I just brewed a fresh pot." The offer of coffee seemed to throw them off balance. Bradley declined curtly and began reading from a prepared list of violations, some so absurd they bordered on comical. Unapproved interior paint color in guest bathroom, non-regulation ceiling fan in master bedroom, suspected business operation based on presence of home office equipment. Each charge was more desperate than the last. As Bradley reached the end of his list, the man I didn't recognize stepped forward with what they clearly believed was their trump card. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening register. "People like you disrupt communities like ours. Either you correct all violations and pay all fines, or we'll make sure you're removed." The threat hung in the air, blatant and undisguised. It was exactly what I had been waiting for. "That's a serious statement, Mr. Anderson," I replied, using his name though he hadn't introduced himself, a small detail that visibly unsettled him. "Perhaps before we proceed further, we should clarify a few points." I walked calmly to my dining room table where I had arranged several documents. "You see, I've been documenting our interactions since the landscape lighting incident. It's an old habit from my previous career." I picked up a leather wallet and opened it, revealing my federal prosecutor identification card. Before my retirement, I spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in racketeering and fraud cases. I'm quite familiar with the law, including trespassing, harassment, intimidation, impersonating law enforcement officers, and racketeering. The room went completely silent. Bradley's face, previously flushed with authority, drained of color. Robert froze with his hand still in my desk drawer. The photographer lowered his camera slowly. "Your inspection warrant isn't worth the paper it's printed on," I continued in the same measured tone I had used to deliver hundreds of arguments. "Your entry into my home under false pretenses constitutes criminal trespass. Your uniforms designed to suggest police authority could be considered impersonation of law enforcement. Your threats about making me leave my home could constitute criminal intimidation. And based on the documents I've gathered about similar actions against other residents, there might be a case for organized racketeering." I gestured to the ceiling corners where small cameras were now visible. "Everything that has happened here this morning has been recorded, as have your previous inspections of my property when I wasn't home." I opened my laptop, showing them multiple camera feeds from around the house. I should mention that these feeds are being monitored remotely by colleagues and are being backed up to secure servers. Bradley found his voice, though it had lost its commanding tone. You can't prove anything. This is HOA business, not a legal matter." I smiled again, this time allowing a hint of the courtroom authority I had wielded for decades to show through. "Actually, Mr. Reynolds, I can prove quite a lot. But this isn't just about your harassment of me." I spread out several documents on the table, financial records, emails, and county planning documents. "This is about the systematic targeting of homeowners whose properties you need for the commercial development plan you've been coordinating with Ridgeview Partners. This is about the misappropriation of HOA funds. This is about the selective enforcement of rules against residents you want to remove while ignoring violations by your allies." Each statement was punctuated by tapping a corresponding document. In my experience, these matters are very much legal issues. The sound of the front door opening interrupted our confrontation. Jennifer walked in, followed by 2 uniformed police officers, real ones this time. "Good morning, Dad," she said casually, as if finding 4 men in pseudo-police uniforms in her father's living room was completely normal. "I brought some friends. Hope you don't mind." The officers stepped forward, their expressions professional but stern. "We received a report of individuals impersonating law enforcement officers," one of them stated. "May I see some identification from everyone present?" Bradley's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Robert began a blustering explanation about HOA authority that trailed off under the officer's unwavering gaze. The carefully orchestrated raid had transformed into a chaotic retreat, their authority evaporating in the face of genuine legal power. That afternoon found me in the county commissioner's office. Commissioner Lisa Bennett was a sharp woman in her 50s who wasted no time on pleasantries. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Mitchell," she began, closing her office door. "Bradley Reynolds has been a problem we've been aware of for some time, but his connections made him difficult to address." I appreciated her directness, if not the admission of administrative cowardice. "Connections shouldn't place anyone above scrutiny," I replied mildly. She nodded, having the grace to look uncomfortable. Several commissioners have close relationships with the developers behind Ridgeview Partners, campaign contributions, family ties. You understand the complications. Over the next hour, Commissioner Bennett shared details that confirmed our suspicions and added new dimensions to the scenario. The commercial development plan for our neighborhood was just one part of a larger redevelopment scheme that certain county officials and business interests had been orchestrating for years. Bradley's role had been to clear the way for the first phase, targeting homeowners like me who needed to be removed for the project to proceed. The worst part, the commissioner confessed, is that most of this was technically legal, aggressive HOA enforcement, strategic property purchases, even the zoning changes, but the methods, the coordination, the deliberate targeting, that crosses ethical and possibly legal lines. When she finished, I had a single question. What do you intend to do about it, Commissioner Bennett? Her answer was straightforward. The county would launch an investigation into the relationships between officials and developers, review all recent zoning decisions, and cooperate with any criminal investigation resulting from the morning's events. Whether her sudden ethical clarity stemmed from genuine concern or fear of political fallout remained to be seen, but I accepted her commitments at face value for now. As our meeting concluded, she asked if I would be willing to serve as a consultant during the investigation. Your prosecutorial experience would be invaluable, and frankly, your presence would add credibility to the process. I agreed to consider it, though I had reservations about being drawn back into public service when I had hoped for a quiet retirement. Back at Maple Ridge Estates, word of the morning's events had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had previously avoided me now approached with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Several shared their own stories of intimidation by Bradley and his team, each account reinforcing the pattern we had documented. Michael had set up a secure online forum where residents could share experiences and evidence, creating a comprehensive picture of the systematic abuse. By evening, we had accounts from over 30 current and former residents, many with supporting documentation. Carmen, drawing on her legal background, organized the information into categories that might support various legal actions, from civil rights violations to fraud. The following day brought a development none of us had anticipated. Bradley had been released on bail, and rather than lying low, he had launched a counteroffensive. A local news site published an article quoting him extensively, claiming he was the victim of a personal vendetta by a former government bureaucrat with an axe to grind. The article portrayed Bradley as a dedicated community volunteer being persecuted for enforcing agreed-upon standards. More troubling were the insinuations that I had used my former position to intimidate honest citizens and was attempting to take over the community for unnamed purposes. The accusations were calculated to sow doubt, particularly among residents who hadn't directly experienced Bradley's abuse of power. This shift in public opinion, minor though it might be, was a reminder that truth alone doesn't always prevail without proper presentation. After some consideration, I called Michael and Carmen. I think it's time we had a community meeting, not an official HOA meeting, just neighbors talking to neighbors. They agreed enthusiastically, and within hours, flyers had been distributed inviting residents to an informal gathering at the community park that evening. The invitation was simple: concerned about recent events in Maple Ridge Estates? Join your neighbors for an open conversation. The turnout exceeded our expectations. Nearly 100 residents gathered in the park as the summer evening cooled. I had deliberately chosen the park rather than my home or the community center, neutral ground where everyone could feel comfortable speaking openly. I stepped forward and began simply, "Thank you for coming. I think we all have questions about what's happening in our community, and I believe the best way forward is through open conversation." For the next hour, we talked as neighbors rather than adversaries. I shared my experience with the HOA's escalating harassment but was careful not to make it solely about myself. Others spoke up, some with similar stories, others with defenses of certain HOA policies they valued. I acknowledged the legitimate role of community standards while questioning the methods of enforcement. When Bradley's supporters raised points, I listened respectfully and addressed their concerns without dismissal. Throughout, I made no mention of my prosecutorial background except when directly asked, preferring to speak as a resident rather than an authority figure. the narrative Bradley had tried to establish, of a power-hungry outsider, was dissolving in the face of straightforward dialogue among neighbors. The next morning brought a knock at my door. Not the aggressive pounding of the HOA raid, but a measured, professional rhythm. I opened it to find two people with badges identifying them as FBI agents. "Mr. Mitchell," the woman asked, "I'm Special Agent Rivera, and this is Special Agent Keller. We'd like to speak with you about some potentially criminal activities involving the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association and related development projects." I invited them in, curious about how federal authorities had become involved so quickly. As if reading my thoughts, Agent Rivera explained, "We've been investigating a multi-state real estate fraud operation for almost a year. Recent events here caught our attention." Over the next 2 hours, I provided a detailed account of everything that had transpired since I moved to Maple Ridge Estates. When I mentioned the anonymous email and confidential document I'd received, both agents straightened noticeably. "We'd very much like to see that document, Mr. Mitchell," Agent Rivera said carefully. After a moment's consideration, I retrieved my laptop and showed them the PDF, a document that detailed plans for a massive redevelopment project, financial projections showing expected returns in the hundreds of millions, and most disturbingly, a list of key stakeholders that included several county commissioners, a state representative, and 2 prominent judges from the district court. Bradley Reynolds' name appeared only under local operations, a minor player in a game much larger than our community dispute. This wasn't just about aggressive HOA tactics or even local corruption. It was systematic capture of municipal governance for private gain, with tentacles reaching into the judiciary itself. My personal victory over Bradley suddenly seemed hollow, a minor skirmish in a much larger conflict. The question now was what to do with this information and who could be trusted to act on it. Commissioner Bennett had seemed sincere in her concerns, but her name appeared in the document as well, not as a key stakeholder but as someone to be managed. As a prosecutor, I had always trusted in the system's ability to correct itself when presented with clear evidence of wrongdoing. Now, I found myself questioning whether that faith had been naive. Our community efforts were gaining traction. The online forum Michael had created was now active with discussions about HOA reform, shared experiences, and coordination of resources. A provisional community committee had formed to review HOA governance and propose new bylaws. Meanwhile, Bradley Reynolds had gone conspicuously quiet. His initial media counteroffensive had fizzled after our community meeting, and now, with federal agents visible in the neighborhood conducting interviews, he seemed to have retreated entirely. His absence created a power vacuum in the HOA which the reform-minded residents were quickly filling. An emergency HOA meeting was called by concerned members, resulting in the temporary suspension of Bradley and his allies from leadership roles pending investigation of their actions. Just as momentum seemed firmly established in our favor, Bradley made his move. Rather than attacking me directly again, he targeted the reform process itself through proxies, residents who had benefited from his preferential treatment. He began raising procedural objections to the interim leadership, questioning the legality of decisions made without his involvement, and suggesting that property values would collapse without strict enforcement of existing standards. These arguments found traction with a segment of the community, particularly newer residents who had invested heavily in their homes. Community meetings became increasingly contentious, with what had been constructive dialogue devolving into factional arguments. This division was precisely what Bradley had hoped to achieve, not necessarily to regain control, but to create enough chaos that higher-level interests could step in with a solution. That solution arrived in the form of a proposal from the county commission. Due to the dysfunction in Maple Ridge Estates' governance, the county would assume temporary oversight of the community through an appointed administrator. In reality, as the confidential document had revealed, it was a mechanism to fast-track the redevelopment plan by bypassing homeowner resistance. The commission vote was scheduled for the following week, with minimal public notice and during the workday when most residents couldn't attend. The county commission chamber was packed beyond capacity when we arrived, with people spilling out onto the front steps and sidewalk. Our community mobilization had worked better than anticipated. Not just Maple Ridge Estates residents, but concerned citizens from across the county had responded to our call. Inside the commission chambers, every seat was taken, with people standing along the walls and crowding the back of the room. The commissioners, clearly surprised by the turnout, conferred urgently among themselves on the raised dais. Commissioner Bennett looked particularly uncomfortable, her eyes scanning the crowd and widening slightly when they met mine. I noticed Agent Rivera standing unobtrusively in a corner, while Agent Keller positioned himself near the exit. The first indication that our strategy had disrupted their plans came when the commission chair attempted to alter the agenda, pushing the Maple Ridge Estates matter to the end of a lengthy docket, a classic tactic to exhaust public attention and thin the crowd. The audience immediately erupted in protests, led by Carmen and several other community organizers we had briefed in advance. "Point of order," called one resident who had researched procedural rules. "Agenda changes require advanced notice according to county bylaws." The county attorney, put on the spot, reluctantly confirmed this was correct. The chair, visibly annoyed, was forced to proceed with the original agenda. When the Maple Ridge Estates matter was called, the county manager presented the administration's case for intervention, a dry recitation of governance failures and community disruption that carefully avoided mentioning the development plans that would follow. As he spoke, Michael quietly distributed information packets to media representatives who had been attracted by the unusual crowd size. These packets detailed the connections between the commissioners, the developers, and the larger redevelopment scheme, with supporting evidence from public records and the confidential document. When the public comment period began, we implemented our planned strategy. Rather than having me speak first as the nominal leader of the opposition, we had organized a sequence of speakers who would build the case step by step. First came Eleanor Wilson, an elderly resident who had been forced to sell her home under pressure from Bradley's tactics. She spoke emotionally of the harassment she had experienced, framing it in the context of the larger scheme, how vulnerable residents were deliberately targeted to clear properties for development. Several other former residents followed with similar stories, creating a pattern too consistent to dismiss as isolated incidents. When my turn came to speak, the groundwork had been thoroughly laid. "Distinguished commissioners, fellow citizens," I began, "what we're discussing today is not simply a neighborhood dispute or a governance issue. It's about whether our county will be governed through transparent democratic processes or through hidden influence and intimidation." I deliberately avoided legal jargon or procedural arguments, speaking instead about principles that anyone could understand: fairness, transparency, community self-determination. I described the raid on my home not as a personal grievance but as an example of how power can be abused when oversight fails. The question before you today is not whether to intervene in Maple Ridge Estates, but whether to stand with your constituents or with those who would use public office for private gain. As I spoke, I could see the calculation happening behind some commissioners' eyes, weighing political survival against whatever commitments they had made to the developers. When I finished, there was a moment of complete silence before the room erupted in sustained applause. The commission chair called for order and announced a 15-minute recess to review new information that has been presented. When the commissioners returned, the shift was immediately apparent. Commissioner Bennett spoke first, her tone markedly different. "In light of the substantial public interest in new information presented today, I move that we table the proposed intervention in Maple Ridge Estates governance and instead form a citizen advisory committee to study community management models and make recommendations." The vote was unanimous. What went unspoken but was understood by everyone in the room was that the development scheme as originally conceived was now effectively dead, too exposed to proceed in the shadows where it had been designed to operate. As the meeting adjourned, the chamber became a flurry of activity. Reporters surrounded various speakers from our group. Bradley and his associates made a hasty exit, pursued by several journalists calling questions about their relationship to the development plan. FBI agents Rivera and Keller moved purposefully towards several commissioners, badges now prominently displayed. That evening, as we gathered at my home to debrief and plan next steps, my phone rang with an unlisted number. It was Agent Rivera. "Mr. Mitchell, we've made several arrests following today's meeting, including Bradley Reynolds and 2 county officials, but we have reason to believe some of the principal financial backers of the development scheme are planning to distance themselves by eliminating connections." Her careful phrasing conveyed the seriousness of the situation. I was awakened just after 2 a.m. by a soft but persistent alert, not the blaring home security system, but a discreet notification Michael had installed on my phone to warn of any unusual activity near the property. Checking the security camera feed, I saw a dark figure moving cautiously along the side of my house. I woke Jennifer and called the emergency number Agent Rivera had provided. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared outside as vehicles silently surrounded the property. The intruder, apparently alerted by the lights, attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended by waiting agents. From my window, I could see them leading away a man I didn't recognize, not Bradley or any of his known associates, but someone new to this unfolding drama. By mid-morning, the story had exploded. Across local and national media, Maple Ridge Estates and its landscape lighting had become the unlikely starting point of a sprawling narrative about corruption, real estate fraud, and community resistance. As news vans began appearing on our street and reporters requested interviews, we issued a simple statement acknowledging the community's role in bringing these issues to light while emphasizing that credit belonged to all residents who had stood together against intimidation. 6 months passed, bringing dramatic changes to both Maple Ridge Estates and the broader community. The federal investigation had expanded to include multiple municipalities and dozens of officials, leading to a series of high-profile indictments and resignations. Bradley Reynolds and several of his associates had accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against higher-level conspirators. The ambitious development scheme that would have destroyed our neighborhood had been permanently shelved, its financial backers now focusing primarily on their legal defense. Commissioner Bennett, though not directly implicated in criminal activity, had announced she would not seek re-election, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. Political language for a career ended by scandal proximity. Within Maple Ridge Estates itself, the transformation had been equally profound. A completely new HOA structure had been established with transparent governance, reasonable enforcement mechanisms, and strong resident participation. Carmen had been elected as the first president of the Reformed Association, bringing her legal expertise and commitment to fairness to the role. The infamous covenant had been thoroughly revised, eliminating vague language and arbitrary restrictions while maintaining reasonable standards to preserve community aesthetics and property values. Perhaps most significantly, a neighborhood mediation committee had been established to resolve disputes before they escalated to enforcement actions, emphasizing communication over confrontation. My own role had evolved as well. After initially declining any formal position in the new HOA structure, feeling it important that leadership come from long-term residents, I had eventually accepted an invitation to serve on the mediation committee. The experience of helping neighbors find common ground through respectful dialogue had proven unexpectedly rewarding, calling on skills I had developed as a prosecutor but allowing me to apply them in a more personal, less formal context. Jennifer teased me that I had simply found a new courtroom, but she also remarked on how much more relaxed I seemed in this role than I had been even during my happiest days as a prosecutor. On a perfect autumn morning, I sat on my porch enjoying coffee and watching the neighborhood come to life. My solar landscape lighting, once the catalyst for so much conflict, had become something of a local landmark. Several other homes had adopted similar designs after the restrictive covenant was revised, creating a pleasing visual rhythm along our street. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Eleanor Wilson, the elderly resident whose painful experience had helped galvanize community support during our struggle. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, still using the formal address despite my many invitations to call me Thomas. "I wanted to bring you something." She handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful handcrafted birdhouse, its base designed with tiny solar lights that matched my landscape lighting perfectly. "For your garden," she explained. "Since you helped us all feel at home again." The simple gift, carrying such profound meaning, moved me more deeply than any formal recognition ever had. That evening, we held a community picnic in the park, a regular event now, part of the ongoing effort to strengthen neighborhood bonds. As I watched children playing, adults conversing in relaxed groups, and even a few of Bradley's former supporters now fully integrated into the community, I reflected on the unexpected journey of my retirement. I had moved to Maple Ridge Estates seeking peace and privacy, never imagining I would find myself at the center of a battle for justice that would ultimately lead to greater fulfillment than I had known as a federal prosecutor. Later, as the gathering wound down, Michael approached with news. The final sentencing in the federal case against the development scheme's masterminds had been announced, substantial prison terms and financial penalties had been imposed, with the judge specifically citing the extraordinary harm to community trust their actions had caused. That night, standing in my kitchen and looking out at the soft glow of my landscape lighting illuminating the peaceful neighborhood beyond, I thought about how often justice depends not on grand institutions, but on individuals willing to stand firm when confronted with wrongdoing. My career had taught me the importance of legal structures and procedural safeguards. But my retirement had reminded me that ultimately, justice lives or dies in communities, in the courage of people like Eleanor, the technical skills of people like Michael, the leadership of people like Carmen, and the professional dedication of people like Agents Rivera and Keller. My contribution had been significant, but far from solitary. True justice, I reflected, is always a collective achievement. As I prepared for bed, I paused at my bedroom window, noticing how the moonlight played on the solar lights lining my walkway. What had begun as a simple aesthetic choice, a lighting design I preferred over the mandated emptiness, had cascaded into consequences I could never have anticipated. It reminded me that principles matter, that standing up for even small freedoms can sometimes reveal and topple much larger injustices. Perhaps that was the lesson I would take from this unexpected chapter of my life, that retirement hadn't removed me from the pursuit of justice but had simply shifted its context from the courtroom to the community. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected illumination. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, drop a justice served in the comments below.